Hello guys, my name is Mike, welcome back to the YouTube channel, and today we're continuing to learn about the past, and this time we're delving back into Sabaton history to understand the story of Witold Pilecki, Inmate 4859. Hope you enjoy. So Sabaton history of Inmate 4859. As I said in the original reaction to the song of this, I only had a very surface level understanding of who Witold Pilecki was, and that was harking back from my days at university with the Heroes of the Holocaust project. As I said in that original reaction video, I went into detail about people like Maximilian Kolbe, but for Witold Pilecki, I only had a very surface level, which I basically just kind of knew the framework of who he was and what he did, but not really any of the real details of it. And you know, from that little that I know and from the song, he is both an extremely tragic but also an extremely heroic individual. And quite frankly, the fact that I don't know him, and the fact that most people, I feel like, can safely say that they've never heard of him either, is somewhat of a travesty, because he deserves to be remembered, and he is really one of the heroes of humanity's darkest times. So I'm coming along, I'm going to learn about this. Hopefully you guys will learn with me, and we can find out more about who this incredible individual was and give him the due reverence that he actually deserves. So without further ado, let's get into it.
The story of Witold Pilecki is one of the great 20th century stories of bravery and sacrifice.
And our song Inmate 4859 is about the brave man Witold Pilecki.
The story of Witold Pilecki is as tragic as it is heroic, and it is one for the ages. He was born in the Russian Empire near the Finnish border in 1901, spent his youth as part of the nationalistic Polish Pathfinders, and fought in independent Poland's new army against the Soviets in the Polish-Soviet War. He lived a peaceful life for much of the interwar years, but eventually returned to the Army Reserve, and in 1939 was mobilized against the German invasion. Pilecki's Ulan regiment was shattered by the advancing Wehrmacht, but he joined other Polish stragglers and kept fighting until the fall of Warsaw. In late October, he disappeared into the underground, where he joined the resistance movement of the Tajna Armia Polska, an arm of the Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army. Now, one of their tasks was to get inside knowledge about German prisoner of war camps, and one camp in particular, in the small town of Auschwitz in German, where many Poles simply disappeared. It was suspected that they were sent to Germany as forced labor, but no one knew for sure. Pilecki came up with a dangerous plan. He would personally infiltrate Auschwitz, uncover the truth, and organize resistance in the camp. On September 19th, 1940, using the alias Tomasz Serafiński, he intentionally walked into a German security sweep on the streets of Warsaw. SS men seized him, and the next day he was herded alongside other Poles into trucks at the Warsaw train station. All day they drove east. The men pressed together without food or water. Now, the rest of this story is told directly from the source material, from Pilecki's personal report about his experiences in the camp. It is not pretty. Arriving at the camp, Pilecki and the crowd of men were driven forward by brutal beatings from the guards. Some men were pulled out of the group at random, unprovoked, and shot in the head to break any thoughts of resistance. Accompanied by the laughter of the guards, they were then pushed on past the barbed wire and towards the parade ground, where a group of men in striped clothes was waiting for them. These men jumped the newcomers with fists and clubs. Some were actually beaten to death. The men in the striped clothes then asked them questions about their backgrounds and their jobs. And those who said academics or doctors were knocked to the ground. With boots kicking against their heads, their murderers proclaimed that this is the concentration camp Auschwitz, my good man.
Yeah, so already what an awakening. You know, as they said, the idea of where the Poles were missing, and they thought that they were being sent to Germany for labour camps. If only that was true. As we know now, and as Witold Pilecki, I assume, would soon find out that well, that would almost sound like paradise in comparison to what Auschwitz actually was. But the fact as well, I just want to mention briefly as well, talking about the Home Army, because I've said it before and I'll continue to say it, because I feel like certain underground resistance groups don't necessarily get the credit or the attention or the recognition for their actions as they really should do. I'm talking about things, everyone talks about the French resistance, and as I said in Uprising, rightfully so, the French resistance played an important role during the Second World War in intelligence gathering, in sabotage, in, just aiding kind of the fight and continuing the fight within occupied France. And that can't be undertaken, but I don't like necessarily how much emphasis gets placed on the French resistance at the cost of the other resistance groups roving around. I'm talking about the Norwegian underground, the Danish underground, the resistance underground things of Belgium and the Netherlands, of Germany within itself, of France, rightfully so, and the same as the partisans in Yugoslavia and Greece, and the Polish Home Army is one key factor of these, along with the Czechs and some of the Slovaks underground resistance as well. And they need to be important reminders as well, because all of this is happening with the Home Army. It's not happening with a proper conventional army. These guys, technically, Poland's out of the fight, officially, and yet these people are still continuing the fight from underground. And that's why they need to be remembered. And in my opinion, I don't want to detract from the French resistance, but rather all other resistance groups and their contribution should be elevated to the same level of coverage as the French resistance, in my opinion. But yeah, let's get back more to the horrors of Auschwitz.
His head shaved, Pilecki hurried out of the bathhouse, though a guardsman knocked out 2 of his front teeth because he did not hold the sign with his prison number between them. From now on, Pilecki was neither himself nor Tomasz, but a number, prisoner 4859. In his paper-thin, blue and white striped uniform and a pair of ill-fitting wooden shoes, he found himself once again on the parade ground. There, he encountered the murderous men again. They were called capos, prisoner functionaries. Often German or Polish criminals, they were tasked with, let's say, keeping things in line inside the camp, since the regular SS men lived in barracks outside, right? Most of the capos were violent sadists who enjoyed brutally beating and torturing the helpless prisoners. Wearing yellow armbands with the capo label, they also oversaw the labor companies, to one of which Pilecki was assigned. In that labor company, it became clear that Auschwitz aimed to first exterminate the Polish intelligentsia. Prisoners with academic backgrounds who were not used to demanding physical work or who lacked the experience or the dexterity to work in the quarries were mercilessly beaten to death by the capos. Being too exhausted to lift another brick or to push a wheelbarrow was also a death sentence. Every evening, fewer people returned to the main camp. Every walk to the latrines, every trip to the bathhouse was accompanied by beatings and harassment. Those who came late to morning parade or tried to hide away were hunted down, dragged to the parade ground, and either hanged or shot in front of the others. Many tried to kill themselves, usually early in the morning before the day of torture began.
So I'm just pausing that there as well. So again, the criminals overseeing the prison camps, not the prison camps, the concentration camps. Another unfortunate reality that you're putting that people who in regular society would be undesirable due to their treatment of their fellow man, and yet you're putting them in charge of work camps, essentially. But then again, I suppose the problem with that is the very act of the Holocaust. You didn't see the people in those camps as human. That's another reason why people try to justify the treatment of those people is because, they weren't people to them, which is equally sickening. But as well, the whole idea of working until your death. So those who are unable to work would be put to death immediately. And those who could be put to work were, but the moment they stopped being useful, that was the end of them. And we could see this as well in other circumstances within the Second World War, particularly with the Japanese treatment of prisoners and prisoners of war with their death marches and the building of various railways and infrastructure projects that the moment that you started to lag behind or fall to exhaustion or something like that, then you would either be left to die or you would be summarily killed immediately. And, you know, such is the way that it just seems, although I'm a historian and, you know, tragedy and stuff like that is part of studying history, it does seem incredibly insane that this was only a handful of decades ago. This is less than a century that humanity, as we like to think it is, and so civilized as it is, was able to act towards each other in such barbarity. And even when, you know, from a historian perspective, you're supposed to try and remove yourself from feeling emotionally connected, I don't think you can, particularly when you're talking about what is essentially the mass extermination of people for no real reason, no rational or logical reason. And I would just like to again reiterate that if you have an opportunity to go to Auschwitz, then it is an incredibly harrowing experience. As he said, when he arrived at the camp, his head was shaved. And the reality for a lot of Jewish people, or not just Jewish people, but people sent to these camps, was when they arrived, they had their belongings taken off of them. They had their shoes taken off of them. Their heads were shaved. And, you know, there's whole collections of them in Auschwitz, where you can actually go. There's an entire hallway filled with shoes of people who entered that camp and never came home. Also, if you ever happen to be in London as well, there's a wonderful, and I hate to say that word in this context, but there's a wonderful exhibit on the Holocaust in the Imperial War Museum in London. And I would strongly recommend that you can go to there. I went there a couple of years ago, not too long after they revamped it and redone it. And again, it kind of just drives home what was going on here. And, you know, it's one of those things where it's extremely important to remember and learn about. And the more that you learn about, the problem is, unlike most things in history, the more you learn about the Holocaust and the mass murder of not just Jewish people, but millions of other people, the more things you learn about it, the worse that it gets. However, having said that, the more that you learn about it is how you learn about individuals like Maximilian Kolbe, like Witold Pilecki here, who in probably some of the darkest pages of human history, you can still find beacons of light somewhere. But yeah.
If anyone tried to escape, the whole block was punished for it, standing out in the open for hours, or doing punishment sports where men too exhausted to lift their arms fell down and died under the boots of the capos. Often, the only time to catch your breath was when they were busy murdering another prisoner. Pilecki's good physical condition saved him from this fate, but for how long could that last? Well, Pilecki set out to build his first resistance cell, a group of 5 men. Later, he would create other 5er groups, but none of them knew of the existence of the others. So in case they were captured and tortured, they could not betray the whole network, right? Those groups would either organize food or clothing, or would help other members to get a job, since it was clear from day one that staying in the worker groups, the labor groups, even well-conditioned men like Pilecki would soon die. So many of those worker prisoners did in fact die that the prisoners had to build the first camp crematorium. Pilecki noted that the camp became one big mill which ground living people to ash. In 1941, as more and more prisoners were brought in, the camp grew. Larger fences were needed, more barbed wire and more guard towers. And as Auschwitz grew, it needed to feed itself. And this opened up jobs for the older prisoners. With careful planning, Pilecki got his 5er groups into the carpenters, the postal service, and the barbers. He eventually got himself a job as a repairman for an oven inside an SS man's house outside the camp. Upon leaving the living hell of Auschwitz, he returned to a world of lavish gardens, laughing children at play, and villagers having normal, everyday conversations with one another. Pilecki felt the questions burning inside him. What was the real world? What was the real nature of man? What was the culture of the 20th century? Since mankind had advanced so far from the barbarism of old, how is this still possible? Or was this the true face of humanity? Would the whole world look like this if the boundaries of civilization disappeared. Each morning, he and the other prisoners found themselves surprised to be alive. Their bodies thin to the bone, black and blue from the daily beatings, riddled with lice and fleas, living on a starvation diet. Only his daily mantra, "You're not giving up," helped Pilecki keep on and try to inspire others to do the same. Survival was only possible through friendship and mutual help. Loners died quick. Now, up until May 1941, it was possible for ordinary Poles to be released from Auschwitz, mostly by their families paying enormous sums to the Germans. Those released prisoners smuggled Pilecki's notes to the Armia Krajowa, but when the war between Germany and the Soviet Union began, this stopped. Instead, new groups began arriving to the camp. Many were now Jews, and by the end of August, the first Soviet prisoners were transported to Auschwitz. Pilecki reports that one day, 700 officers were tightly packed into a room all day, till finally a group of German soldiers with gas masks on threw gas containers inside. This was the first act of gassing people with hydrogen cyanide at Auschwitz, according to Pilecki. Soon after, though, on his way to work, he passed groups of naked Soviet prisoners waiting to be led into the crematorium, where they were gassed and burned. The capos were often brutal savages, but the bestiality of some of the SS guards was even worse. Pilecki tells of guard dogs trained to go for the throats of prisoners, the torture of smashing testicles with a hammer, and many stories far too nightmarish to tell here. Now, with his cells set up in important positions all over the camp, Pilecki was ready to start a revolt, but he needed help from the outside to be successful. The prisoners were thirsty for revenge, and they were ready for anything since they did not fear death after all they had endured. But even had they managed to overwhelm the guards and take the camp, they would not be able to hold it for long. Pilecki believed that the Armia Krajowa had received at least one of his messages. He had urged them to stage an attack or send in paratroopers from the Free Polish Army over in Britain or drop a crate of arms onto them or something. But so far, nothing. Without help from the outside, Pilecki's third Christmas in Auschwitz came and went. And Auschwitz was now changing. There was no longer collective punishment, no outright murder, or even everyday brutality, or at least it was toned down. See, Auschwitz became a factory which would now systematically murder its prisoners instead of individualistic random killing. Not with the batons of the capos, but with phenol and gas. There were 3 crematoriums working simultaneously, able to burn corpses within minutes.
Yeah, and that's the terrifying part of it, is you had the brutality of the capos just randomly murdering people at will, or the guards just randomly killing people at will, or once they stopped being useful. But then almost the brutality seemed to dissipate, and in its place was cold efficiency. And that's the scary thing about it, was how efficient it was able to be. As they said, it essentially became a factory, a conveyor belt of murder, of extermination of people. And yeah, as he said earlier in this video, what I said earlier in this video, you know, you're thinking, when we're supposed to be civilized, then yeah, it was only less than a century ago we was able to be this barbaric to people. And that whole concept of what is human nature. Is human nature our modern civilized society that we live in now, or is our human nature something far, far darker? And the kind of the laws and the restrictions and governments in place now are kind of the things that are holding us from just tearing each other apart. That's one probably for the psychologists to discuss. I'm not willing to kind of share a light on that. I would like to think that inherently human beings want to do good, and we want to live, you know, to quote the great dictator in Charlie Chaplin, not Adolf Hitler, you know, human beings want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. That's how I like to try and view people as a whole, but I do also understand that human beings are also capable of carrying out extreme and horrific acts of brutality towards each other. It's like Unit 371, I think, if I'm correct, with the Japanese treatment, where they carried out horrific experiments on Koreans and POWs and stuff like that, you know, like acid and boiling people alive and all different types of things, basically experimenting various different ways to killing people, some of which cause extreme amount of pain, but I don't really want to go into here. Perhaps if there's another video on that and that kind of atrocity, then perhaps that's the time for another time. But yeah.
By April 1943, more and more of the surviving Poles were sent out of Auschwitz to make room for Jewish prisoners from all over Europe and the Soviet Union. This meant the end of Pilecki's network, as its members were sent to other camps. So after 2 years and 7 months of surviving in Auschwitz, Pilecki decided it was time to break out, since an uprising was no longer possible. He got a night shift job at a bakery outside the camp. Shortly after Easter, as one guard was asleep, he and 2 other men pushed the door open and ran. Shots cracked out behind them, but they ran all night and all day until they reached a small town. With help from patriotic Poles, Pilecki smuggled himself back to Warsaw, where, on August 23, 1943, after nearly 1,000 days in Auschwitz, he met with commanders of the Armia Krajowa, telling them of his experiences, all the death, all the torture, but people hesitated to believe him. It seemed all too unbelievable, even for the hated Germans to do all this killing. They knew it was bad, but not this bad. Pilecki would stay in the underground army and fight in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. He was later interned in prisoner of war camps, and after liberation in 1945, was assigned to the 2nd Corps of the Polish Army in Italy, where he turned in his report about Auschwitz to the British. For Pilecki, Auschwitz was the symbol of the Polish struggle for existence. He himself could never go back to a normal civilian life after experiencing what you've just heard. He maintained contact with the underground resistance, now against the Soviet Union, after the war, and indeed returned to Poland in late 1945 to report on the Soviet occupation. He lived and worked undercover, but on May the 8th, 1947, the Ministry of Public Security captured him. He was tortured and dragged before a kangaroo court and accused of many things, including espionage and planning an armed uprising. The sentence was death. On May 25th, 1948, in the Mokotów prison in Warsaw, Witold Pilecki was executed. His final resting place remains unknown.
So just quickly there, just rest in peace, Witold Pilecki. Hopefully you're at peace now. But show trials and stuff like that. Unfortunately, an all too common factor of the Soviet Union and later the USSR to a larger extent, where people who were deemed to be dissidents or dangers to the public, as they was called, when in reality they were just necessarily not the favourite people of the communists, would find themselves usually tortured, either tortured into admitting things that they had no part in, under duress, and that would be used as evidence, or they were just brought towards a show trial, which, as the name suggests, show trial. There was no intention of having a fair trial, there was no intention of justice. It was just to be seen to be having a trial, and almost a similar way to the gallows or something like that. Show trials acted as is a very public message as well to people who might seem to be enemies of the state, as a sign of what will happen to you if you do this. And it's the thing, as he said, he fought in the Second World War, he went into Auschwitz and survived for years, he fought in the Warsaw Uprising and survived all of that, only to be killed by Soviet officials and Polish communists. You kind of makes you lost for words. As I said in the original reaction to this video, you try and detach yourself emotionally from the events and from these individuals when you're studying history, but it is incredibly difficult not to feel some sort of anger or sadness at his story, having gone through so much hardship and so much pain and so much suffering, and that ultimately his story is cut far too short on the actions of, political ideology. But yeah.
In 1990, Pilecki and others from that show trial were rehabilitated, and today he is celebrated, and with good reason, as a Polish patriot and a hero. Now, we cannot even imagine what he went through and what courage it must have taken to do so. It's a pretty heavy story,
Yeah, I gotta be honest, I don't know how many people we researched for the Heroes album, but if there ever was a slam dunk, part of my language, what the fuck moment, this was it, I would say.
And it is, their sacrifice is one thing, bravery is another thing, but doing all of that, think of the odds. Getting in and getting out.
Yeah, I'm gonna go to Auschwitz on purpose.
And then I'm gonna get out on purpose. And doing all that for a cause, and for what is a noble and a just cause, any way you slice it.
Yeah, and I am so surprised also that how isn't there a major Hollywood blockbuster about this?
That makes no sense at all.
Yeah, and people are coming up with, Hollywood scripts. I'm not bashing the film industry here, don't get me wrong, but people are making scripts that are less fantastic and not true, and still nobody.
And this is a true story, and even the tragic ending and stuff,
Yeah.
It's,
maybe that's why they're not doing it.
Well, they could throw in a romantic interest or something. They could have Gwyneth Paltrow, maybe. I don't know.
Romance in Auschwitz, great.
Stranger things have happened in Hollywood.
Yes, true.
But that leads you to wonder. There must have been romantic stories in Auschwitz.
I guess so. We met a woman called Anna who fought in the Polish resistance during the uprising.
Yeah.
She actually said that, she was flirting with a guy in the middle of, not as they were shooting, I guess.
Yeah. But that's not 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Exactly. So, she said it's strange how you can normalize such a extreme situation and life still goes on. You still go to the toilet, everybody understands that, but you are still actually falling in love while fighting or waging a war, It's weird.
And if this guy could break out, then of course you could break from the men's side to the women's side.
Yeah.
It's nothing. If there's one thing this all proves is nothing is impossible. Nothing is as impossible as you think. I know, but it's, what would, even more than just a Hollywood movie, it'd be a good miniseries.
Yes, actually. HBO, do you hear this?
See, if anybody out there's HBO is listening, and Yuki and I will write it. I'm a writer, and he's good at emotion, so together we could do it.
Yeah, but don't put me in acting in it because I suck as an actor. So,
as we've noticed over these months of Sabaton History, ladies and gentlemen. What about the actual song itself, though? Did you decide on the topic before you wrote the song, or did you have the music sitting around and
I wrote the music with Peter, our producer. The first time we wrote a song together. And him, coming from, Lindemann, Pain, Hypocrisy, those bands, and the harder side of things, it became a bit of a harder and very, very dark song. So as we were writing that song, I realized that this is the song, because obviously, even though it's a very, very, we're singing about a very courageous man, it would not have made sense at all to have a, proud, uplifting song for the subject.
For especially, I wonder what he was like as a person, like personality-wise, because you don't. From the story, you can see, okay, he's got a lot of dedication, but you meet someone on the street, you don't know if they're a dedicated type person or not. No. So it would be really interesting. Well, that's your homework, guys, to go and put the song on and think of Witold Pilecki.
That's all for today. Thank you very much.
See you next time.
All right, everyone, here's the drill. A lot of you have been supporting us through Patreon, and I'd like to thank you all so much for that. It really helps. That's what makes this channel happen. So click on subscribe. You know the drill, basically. And I just wanted to say thank you all. See you soon.
Yeah, so just as they said at the end, please, again, if you aren't already, go over to Sabaton, go over to Sabaton History, support them on Patreon if you can, and we have the funds to do so. I know some funds can be tight during COVID and stuff like that, but if you do, obviously they do a great job here. And I just want to touch on what they said at the end there as well, with the Hollywood movies, this type of thing it is true. And not just necessarily for this story, but I feel like there's a lot of history, or there's a lot of stories that would make perfect cinema, would make perfect miniseries, if handled with a correct amount of respect and diligence to the stories that they're telling. I'm not talking about Braveheart levels or the Patriot levels, where you're taking historical figures or historical events and completely misconstruing them for the sake of whether that be directors or writers' politics or whatever would suit the audience. But I feel like, again, this man's story, the reason why so many people don't know who he is because his story hasn't really been told. And how many other people in history can we say similar things about, or how many groups of history can we say similar things about that their stories haven't been told because they don't fit necessarily a kind of a media profile that makes them all happy and a happy ending. We live in an age where things like the Marvel films do amazingly well, and they make hundreds of millions of pounds, and blockbusters every year with about 4 or 5 of them coming out annually. And they're films about superheroes, and while I'm not detracting from them, but these types of people, these are what, when you say superhero, Witold Pilecki is one. And unlike, your Spider-Mans or your Iron Mans, he's real. He was a real person. And how many other people are like that, whose stories deserve to be known? I'm biased anyway, but that type of story should be the story that we're telling people, not necessarily about fictional people wearing suits saving the day, when there was real historical people who deserve to be, just as well known as the people that we know from comic books or comic strips. Have to say, that's not hating on, again, Marvel or the Hollywood thing as it was, blockbusters and stuff like that, but it does annoy me how there seems to be a hassle of repeating unoriginal scripts, unoriginal stories, or just producing, the same type of boring thing, when there's, history, not just the story of Witold Pilecki, but history is so rich in stories, rich in, everything that you could need in a good drama, a good tragedy, a good comedy, and yet so many of it goes lacking, because I feel like it will require the audience, or even the directors perhaps, to learn a little bit, and perhaps widen their views and their opinions beyond what they know. And I feel like if more audience directors and writers were willing to open their minds and explore the past and learn about the past a bit more, then perhaps maybe we could actually get the stories of Witold Pilecki. It's a bit like the Chernobyl miniseries. I wonder how many people watch Chernobyl and now have a greater deal of understanding, of a greater deal of admiration for the people involved in the Chernobyl nuclear incident, and the sacrifices that some of them made, the cost that was made into cleaning that up. Chernobyl has shown that a miniseries taking that on board can work and can be extremely successful and kind of ram home to audiences, and so there's no reason why other things can't also do the same. I also do like that they talked about the music as well. As I said, I don't usually talk about the music too much, or people don't necessarily watch this, I don't think, to hear me critique music. But I also extremely agree with when he says that, the kind of theme and the story of the song wouldn't suit a kind of upbeat, kind of proud thing. In comparison to, say, something like Shirayama or, A Ghost in the Trenches, not something necessarily, proud, upbeat, telling the story in a triumphal manner, because ultimately, at its heart of it, it is a tragedy. It's about a man who is extremely courageous, extremely determined to do his duty. But eventually it cost him his life. In attempting to do his duty to his homeland and his own people, it cost him. and you know that is in essence a tragedy. But that has been Sabaton History, Inmate 4859, the story of Witold Pilecki, a man who deserves to be remembered. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you've learned just as much as I have, and I hope to see you next time. Please stay safe. Rest in peace, Witold.